Wel, Prynhawn da, thank you for joining me today. It's been a couple of months since I was last here speaking about the pandemic. And since then, we have seen a steady decline in cases of coronavirus and a gradual transfer of the rules, those rules which have kept us safe, from being legal requirements to being things set out in advice and guidance. And as the impact of the virus has reduced, we've all been able to get on with our day-to-day lives. It's thanks to those efforts of people all across Wales that the virus is once again receding. People have worked together to keep ourselves safe and to keep others safe as well. Today, as ever, I will provide an update about the public health situation here in Wales, the outcome of the latest 3-week review of the coronavirus regulations, and I also hope to look forward a little to the summer and the months that lie beyond. Here is a slide to begin with, and a slide which shows how the virus is behaving here in Wales and in the rest of the United Kingdom. This slide shows the very latest results of the ONS Coronavirus Infection Survey, and that was published at 12 noon today. You will see from it that right across the United Kingdom, from the start of April onwards, coronavirus has been declining steadily in each of the 4 nations since the last wave of Omicron. Today's results suggest that 1 in every 55 people in Wales have coronavirus. So the virus certainly hasn't just gone away. But cases are on the decline. You will see the red line there that shows that regular decline week by week since the first part of April, continuing right up to the most recent months. So this sustained decline in community transmission has been mirrored in falls in the number of COVID-19 related patients in our hospitals. There are now 650 people fewer in hospital. Sorry, I beg your pardon. There are now fewer than 650 people in hospital with COVID-19 across Wales, and that's the lowest since the end of December last year. The NHS continues to be incredibly busy. It continues to deal with very significant emergency pressures. It continues to deal with the effects of coronavirus, and our staff in the NHS are doing everything they can to make up ground lost during the COVID crisis. Every one of us can help the NHS by choosing the right service if we need to use its care. And if you aren't sure where you should go to get the help that you need, then right across Wales you can call NHS 111 for that advice and help. Now, over the last few months, we have gradually removed the remaining coronavirus protections from the law in Wales as we've stepped beyond the emergency response to the pandemic. As we've done so, we've strengthened our guidance to help one another keep Wales safe. And thank you to all of those who continue to follow that advice. Here in Wales, people continue to take up the offer of vaccination, the single most important protection against this virus. It gives vital protection against serious illnesses and the risk of ending up in hospital. Almost 3/4 of care home residents and people over 50 have had their spring booster, and every week we still have thousands of people coming forward to have their first and second doses of the vaccine. It's never too late to be vaccinated here in Wales. If you are one of those people who haven't yet, had a first or second dose or your booster, then please come forward, make the arrangements, get yourself vaccinated. Now, up until today, we've had one legal protection which has remained in place for the longest period of time. And this has been the requirement, the legal requirement, to wear face coverings in health and social care settings. At this 3-week review, having carefully looked at all the evidence, the Cabinet has decided that that regulation, and therefore all the legal coronavirus regulations, will end on Monday of next week. This means that it will no longer be a legal requirement to wear a face covering when visiting a health or care setting. But that doesn't mean that it's no longer a sensible thing to do. And we strongly recommend that people visiting a hospital or a primary care surgery continue to use face coverings to protect vulnerable people and the people who have to work in those settings all the time. Now, we have lived with the legal protections and the coronavirus regulations for more than 2 years. They have helped to keep us all safe. But as we head towards the summer, with an improving public health outlook, increasing knowledge of the virus, high vaccination coverage, we can expect that the impact of coronavirus will now remain steady here in Wales. And that will allow us to make some changes to some other key features of our response to the pandemic. Here inside the Welsh Government, we will reduce the intense cycle of meetings which have brought together ministers, the Chief Medical Officer, or scientific advisors and others. The end of the regulations also mean that we will no longer need to review those regulations every 3 weeks, and we won't need to come here to hold these press conferences. And we will pause the regular meetings we have held throughout the pandemic with our trusted partners, businesses, trade unions, other public sector organisations to focus on the pandemic itself. We will put all these measures on hold, however. We're not simply abandoning them, we are pausing them in case we see another pandemic wave later in the autumn or the winter, as we saw last year and as we saw the year before. What we will do is to use this period, the summer period, to prepare for what might happen later in the year. Our aim will be to manage coronavirus as we would manage any other seasonal illness. But we have learned time and again that this virus can behave in ways that are neither expected nor predictable. Even today, we are currently carefully monitoring 2 new variants of the Omicron form of COVID. They're called BA4 and BA5. Now, only a small number of these cases have been detected here in Wales so far, but they have caused large outbreaks elsewhere in the world, and the 4 chief medical officers right across the United Kingdom have warned that these new variants could cause an increase in cases here in the future. That is why, while we are pausing other arrangements, we will continue to have a powerful set of measures to keep coronavirus and its development under our gaze here in Wales. And we'll be ready to bring back testing and contact tracing if we should see an increase in cases and widespread harm. We're preparing already for the autumn booster vaccination programme, and this year we will run an extended flu jab campaign, offering free vaccinations to anybody aged over 50 and to secondary school pupils. It's really important to get a flu jab this coming year. We've had very low levels of flu for the last couple of years, partly because of all the protections we've all been taking. But as those things reduce, we are receiving reports of very high levels of flu in the southern hemisphere, and we must expect that there is a risk of a high flu season here in Wales in the coming autumn and winter. So today we've reached another important milestone in our responses to the pandemic in Wales. Unfortunately, the end of the regulations doesn't mean the end of coronavirus, but it does mean that we can take another step forward to living safely with COVID-19. The pandemic has had a huge impact on all our lives. Everyone has been asked to sacrifice so much and have had to make so many changes to our lives. I want to end this press conference by thanking everyone for everything that you have done. By following the rules, by looking out for one another, we have all helped to keep Wales safe. Now, let's enjoy the summer together as we plan and prepare for whatever the future may bring. Diolch o galon I chi gyd. And as ever, we have some journalist colleagues here with us to ask questions, and I'll go first of all today to James Williams at the BBC.
Diolch yn fawr i chi, Prif Weinidog. Can I start with a few practical questions? Is it still your plan to end free lateral flow tests for symptomatic people, contact tracing, support payments and so on at the end of June? You say also that you'll bring back contact tracing and testing if need be, but you've said that you basically got to end it because of decisions made by the UK government. Is it still the case, and therefore you'd need a decision from Westminster to bring them back? And do you still think it's proportionate for some hospitals to have restrictions on visitors?
Okay, thank you, James. So your first two questions are interconnected. So in Wales at the moment, we have a stock of lateral flow tests. We have about 90 million of them in our stocks. The question we have to ask ourselves is how best to use that stock. Should we continue to offer free lateral flow tests to symptomatic people during the summer? Or should we maximise those stocks in case they are needed because of a further upswing in the virus in the autumn and the winter? We're still discussing that. We're looking, for example, at the rate at which lateral flow tests are being taken up in Wales, and that rate has gone down week by week in the more recent times. So we will come to a decision about what happens beyond June, and it may well be that in the summer months we won't be able to offer free lateral flow tests, but if we don't, it will be because we are making sure that we have the stock we need against the day when they become a more necessary part of the defences we would all need. We are talking to the UK government about whether there will be a further purchase of lateral flow tests across the United Kingdom for the autumn and the winter. And again, that is part of our calculation. If the UK government does intend to purchase a further supply, then we may be able to release more of what we've got earlier than would otherwise be the case. But that conversation is not concluded. Is it right that hospitals continue in some circumstances to restrict visits? Well, I think the answer to that has to be yes. And that is because it is a clinical decision. It's not a decision made by ministers. It's a decision made by people on the spot, knowing the calculation they have to make between the vulnerability of the people who they have on that ward and the risks that people come into the ward with coronavirus. With 1 in 50 people or so in Wales with coronavirus, it means there's 80,000 people in Wales who've got coronavirus today. When people in hospitals make difficult decisions about restricting visiting what they're doing is trying to minimise the chance that one of those 80,000 people could walk onto the ward and end up infecting people for whom falling ill with coronavirus would be an even more serious risk.
Sorry, bai fi, ydych chi ateb hynny'n Gymraeg hefyd?
Ie, wrth gwrs. Wel, y dau gwestiwn oedd James Williams yn ofyn i fi yn gyntaf, maen nhw'n dod dy gilydd. Mae 90 miliwn o profion lateral flow dal da ni yma yng Nghymru, a ni'n dal i drafod sut i defnyddio nhw. Allwn ni cario ymlaen ar ôl diwedd mis Mehefin i roi nhw am ddim i bobl yma yng Nghymru dros yr haf, neu ydy yn well i cadw nhw rhag ofn bydd rhaid i ni defnyddio nhw yn yr hydref neu y gaiaf os bydd coronavirus yn dod nôl. A ni'n dal i trafod hwnna. Mae'r galw am profion wedi mynd lawr wythnos ar ôl wythnos pan mae coronavirus yn mynd i lawr. Mae'n posib bydd hi ddim yn wneud synwyr i cadw profion am ddim dros yr haf. Mae hwn yn dibynnu hefyd ar trafodaethau gyda Llywodraeth y Deyrnas Unedig. Os mae nhw'n mynd i prynu fwy o brofion, ledled i ni gyd dros y Deyrnas Unedig am yr hydref ac y gaia. Ni ddim wedi dod i'r ben yn y trafodaethau na eto. Y cwestiwn am ymwelwyr i'r ein ysbytau ni, wel mae'n pwysig yn fy marn i wneud y penderfyniadau na, i roi y penderfyniadau na i bobl sy'n gweithio ar y llawr. Nhw sy'n gwybod am y risgau, nhw sy'n gwybod am y cyflwr y bobl sydd yn y ward. Ambell waith, maen nhw'n dod at y casgliad. Mae'r risg o cael coronavirus yn dod i fewn i'r ysbytau yn golygu mae'n rhaid iddyn nhw roi rai cyfyngiadau ar posibiliadau i bobl ymweld â bobl, ond maen nhw'n wneud hwnna i warchod bobl sy'n dost ac yn ysbytau ni yn barod.
Ac yn second then, there are still calls on you to hold a Wales-specific COVID inquiry. You've persistently said that you don't think that's the best way of getting answers here in Wales, but that you've kept the door ajar for a Welsh-specific inquiry if certain conditions aren't met with the UK inquiry. Now that that is sort of moving forward in terms of a chair and terms of reference and so on, is the door now firmly closed on the idea of a Welsh-specific COVID inquiry? Again, yn Gymraeg, please.
Diolch yn fawr, James. So I don't intend to launch a Welsh-specific inquiry. I think that, as I've said all along, would not provide the answers that people quite rightly are looking for from an inquiry. And as the UK inquiry has firmed up, I've become more confident that it will do the job that people in Wales quite rightly look to it to do. So, for example, in the most recent iteration of the terms of reference for the inquiry, all of those are available on the inquiry's website, and from the moment they went up, they were available in the Welsh language as well as in English. I think the inquiry and Judge Hallett's team have demonstrated from the outset that they are sensitive to the needs of Wales, that they are determined, that they will shine a light on those developments and decisions that happened here in Wales, and that they will be able to provide answers which go beyond the actions of the Welsh Government and other public bodies here in Wales in the narrow sense, and to make sense of those decisions, because it will be able to investigate the UK-wide context within which those decisions are made. All of those things, I think, have swung the argument powerfully behind allowing Judge Hallett to carry out her inquiry and to go about it in the way that I believe she has already demonstrated will be respectful to Wales, determined to include what happened here in Wales and to make best sense of it. Wel, yn fy marn i, y ffordd gorau i roi ar atebion mae bobl yn Cymru yn eisiau weld yw i roi ar cyfrifoldeb i'r dwylo bobl sy'n gyfrifol am yr ymchwil nawr ar lefel y Deyrnas Unedig. Am beth dwi wedi weld, mae'r Judge Hallett wedi dangos yn barod parch llawn i'r pethau yma yng Nghymru. Pan oedd yn hi'n cyhoeddi pethau ar y wefan yn y gwaith mae hi wedi wneud a'r sgwp yr ymchwil, mae popeth wedi fod yna yn Saesneg ac yn Gymraeg o'r ddechrau. Mae'r bobl yn y tîm wedi fod yma yng Nghymru siarad gyda bobl yma yng Nghymru. A trwy wneud hynny, dwi'n yn fwy hyderus nawr. Bydd yr ymchwil ar lefel y Deyrnas Unedig yn mynd i parchu pethau yma yng Nghymru, mynd i ganolbwyntio ar y penderfyniadau sydd wedi cael ei wneud yma yng Nghymru, ond i roi hwnna yn y cyd-destun y Deyrnas Unedig i gyd, a dim ond trwy wneud hynny, allwch chi weld yn glir pan oedd pethau wedi digwydd yn y ffordd mae wedi digwydd, ac i roi ar atebion mae pobl yma yng Nghymru yn eisiau weld. James, diolch yn fawr. Thank you very much. Over to Rob Osborne at ITV Wales.
Afternoon, First Minister. Picking up on the theme James raised with you about hospitals and visitors, do you believe that some Welsh hospitals are being too cautious?
Well, Welsh Government has published renewed advice for hospitals and boards across Wales, both in terms of general visiting, but also specifically in the context of maternity care, which we know has been a particularly difficult issue throughout the pandemic. Our advice urges health boards to do as much as they can to allow visiting to take place in as normal a way as possible. But in the end, those decisions can only be made by doctors and nurses who are running those wards on the spot. As I said in my answer to James, the population of patients on a ward changes every day. In this whole journey out of the legal restrictions, we have received concerns from those people whose underlying health conditions make them particularly vulnerable to the virus. People who are not well already, more likely to be in hospital, more likely to be vulnerable to the virus. Those are the considerations that people on the spot in hospital wards are picking up. Nobody is preventing visitors because they don't like to see visitors. They are making that difficult calculation about the risks that visiting poses and the vulnerability of the people that they are looking after.
But isn't the difficulty there that hospitals are always going to urge on the side of caution, and they are going to do what they can to try and stop anything coming into the hospital? So are you prepared to step in further if it becomes apparent that hospitals are putting in barriers which seem unnecessary as we go forward in the coming weeks and months?
Yeah, Rob, what I want to see is consistency of decision-making in different parts of Wales. I don't want to see some places where there is a level of aversity to risk that in another hospital in another part of Wales would not be regarded in that way. In the end, if you're asking me, what risk would I rather run? Would I rather the risk to the health of a vulnerable person caused by coronavirus? 100 people have died from coronavirus in Wales in the month of May. This is still not a trivial illness. And if a team of doctors and nurses on a ward come to the conclusion that the risks to those patients are such that visiting has to be restricted, I'd rather they made that decision. You can come and visit on another day. You won't be there if you've been exposed to coronavirus and you don't survive that experience. Rob, thanks very much for those questions. To Jordan Howell at LBC.
Thank you, First Minister. While today's news will be welcomed by many, those working in health and social care settings and patients too might be uncomfortable with the removal of face coverings. I know it's still recommendation, but what would you say to those people that are concerned about that?
Well, I'll just repeat what I'd said earlier, Jordan, that the fact that it's no longer a legal requirement definitely does not mean that it isn't the right thing to do. We have taken some comfort in this from the experience in England and Scotland, who lifted the legal requirement some weeks ago, but where the reports we have had from those health services is that level of mask wearing by visitors to the settings remains very high. And that's because I think, we can rely on the simple good sense of most people. People who take the trouble to go to see somebody in hospital do not seem to me to be people who would want to put those people at risk. And if a simple wearing of a mask, which remains advisable, is the way that you can help to keep that person safe, I think we will continue to see very high levels of mask wearing in Wales, as we have seen in both Scotland and England, where the legal requirement was removed some weeks ago.
Thank you. And the Welsh Government's faced criticism throughout the pandemic for the speed in which it's made decisions compared to other nations. Certainly, you mentioned them there. Do you stand by the decisions you've made throughout the pandemic and the speed at which you made them?
Jordan, there's always been questions about speed of decision making. There are only two sorts. I get asked whether we've done things too quickly, and then I get asked whether we've done things too slowly. So, of course, you can always have a debate about the pace at which changes are made. We have always taken the view here that it is better to do things step by step, that it is better to do things in a careful way. That has meant that we've taken some decisions according to a different timescale, even though, as you saw on that graph, generally across the United Kingdom, the trend has been the same everywhere. We've either all been having to impose new restrictions, or we've all been in the business of gradually lifting them. I think we have succeeded as best we can in the light of the advice we have had, and to have done it in a way that the majority of people in Wales have felt comfortable that decisions are being made that have contributed to keeping them safe. Jordan, thank you very much. To Will Hayward at Wales Online.
Thank you, First Minister. What does the schedule for COVID vaccinations look like from here on in? Will it just be the vulnerable and elderly who get them? Or will everyone get one? And how many times a year will that be? And just finally, how likely are they to be adapted from the vaccinations we've already had?
Yeah, thanks, Will. So we've seen the preliminary advice of the JCVI, but it's not their final advice, and they were very at pains when they published their preliminary advice to say, you shouldn't be just relying on this. There will be a further and final version of the advice. To me, it looks as though they will advise us to move to a single annual system of vaccination, like flu vaccination. You get it once and you get it at the right time of year. So this is likely to be an autumn and early winter programme of vaccination. There is some debate still, I think, within the JCVI at the categories of people who should be included in that free vaccination programme. And there are a couple of things in that. It's how low down the age range should you go? Should this be for people over 80, over 70, over 65? We'll wait to see where that debate finally lands. And then, if you do have an age cut-off, let's say, and I've got no evidence for this, just to be clear, that they decided to go for 70, then what about people below the age of 70 who are vulnerable in some way or another? What about unpaid carers? What about other groups who, in previous rounds of vaccination, have been covered, but not in a way that is just an age cut-off way? So I am expecting that we will have a campaign here in the autumn, a vaccination campaign, that it will certainly cover the most elderly people in the population, and I'm hoping we will have advice from the JCVI that allows us to provide vaccination for other vulnerable groups.
Great. So it doesn't seem like there'll be kind of universal vaccinations like we've seen so far then.
I don't think that's what we're expecting.
Okay. I can ask, have you read the Sue Gray report and what are your main takeaways from it? And are you persuaded by the Prime Minister's apologies?
Well, I have seen the Sue Gray report. Truthfully, the biggest reaction I have to it is a sense of despair, really, that things could have got to a pitch where, right at the heart of government, where all those decisions were being made that had such an impact on other people's lives, that people conducted themselves in the way that we did. And the Sue Gray report has now all those pretty grim details of the way that people felt it was all right for them to behave. I don't think the Prime Minister can escape from his responsibility simply by apologising for it and saying that when he entered a room where people were eating and drinking, sitting on each other's laps, planning to spend the night there into the early hours, that he didn't realise that this was not consistent with the rules that he himself was setting. I'm afraid I don't find that credible, and I don't think many other people do either.
Thank you.
Thanks, Will. To Harry Hansen at That's TV.
Thank you. Good afternoon, First Minister. I wanted to bring your attention to Swansea Business Improvement District's very early plans of turning Swansea City into an urban solar farm to, move the city closer to reaching net zero targets and help residents in the long run with the cost of living. Would this be something that the government would offer financial support to later on down the line?
Well, Harry, we've definitely offered financial support to solar farms developed by other local authorities in Wales. In Monmouthshire, for example, the county council there has a significant solar farm, and that was the result of Welsh Government investment alongside their own investment. The future of energy needs in Wales has to be met through renewable energy. We've got such opportunities here to do that. I'm very pleased to see that in Swansea there are new ideas coming forward. You'll understand, if there's public money being invested, then we would have to do all the normal things that we would do to make sure that that money was being invested in the right way. But the basic principle that you asked about, we've demonstrated that because we've already done it elsewhere.
Thank you. You mentioned that you're happy to see these new ideas, and this plan, it's a huge plan, probably the biggest solar farm in the UK, if not beyond. There's talking, putting solar panels on pretty much any roof that will take a solar panel. Do you think this is a good idea, and do you think this is something that maybe should be taken and enacted in other cities across the UK?
Well, look, solar is a great success story in Wales and across the United Kingdom. When solar panels were first being used, it was expensive electricity. Now it's amongst the cheapest electricity you can buy. And look, what we need to be focused on are innovative ways in which we can go on developing those technologies. I was in Norway last week and I met with two major renewable energy companies. Statkraft, which is the renewable energy company that comes out of the Sovereign Wealth Fund of Norway. And then I met with a company called Olsons, which is a major investor in renewable energy across the world, including in the United Kingdom, and are very keen to come to Wales. They are developing, their focus in solar is on floating solar, where we can use the surface of reservoirs, of lakes, and in their case, at the very innovative end, they are even developing floating solar on the sea, which you can imagine is, a technical challenge that is very significant. But they were very keen to talk to me about where there will be possibilities in Wales of using that form of solar energy. So, we're certainly not at the end of the solar story. There are still innovations, there are still new ways of drawing more energy from the sun, and making our contribution here in Wales to the renewable energy of the future, with everything that means for global warming and those other great challenges of our time. Harry, thank you very much. Tom Magner next at Carers World.
Thank you very much indeed, First Minister. If I may bring you back to the subject of COVID. On the 26th of January, your colleague, the Health Minister, announced that £4.5 million would be spent over 2 years to investigate and learn from all incidents of hospital-acquired COVID in Wales. The process by which this will actually happen does remain unclear to our viewers, so some clarification on that would be useful. But it seems to me that the key question is, what will success look like to you as First Minister, looking back when these investigations are complete? In other words, how will you judge that the money was well spent, that the business case for spending this £4.5 million was met?
Thanks very much, Tom. I'm relying on my memory for the first part of this answer, so we'll let you know if I don't remember it all absolutely correctly. My memory is that there are two major strands in that 4.5 million. The greater strand was in providing more money directly to health boards to allow them to employ the staff that you need if you're going to do those individual investigations that you need. When I met, as I have a number of times, bereaved families in Wales, one of their anxieties was the length of time it was taking in order to get answers about what had happened to their own loved ones. And that was partly just because, that requires a lot of assembling of information, analysing information, and there just weren't enough hands on deck in health boards to be able to do that as quickly and as thoroughly as we would like. So more than half the money, as I recall, is going to that. And then the other part of the money is to provide a national set of arrangements so that we get consistency between the way in which different health boards go about those investigations. So, I think it's right that the bulk of the money goes to the people actually doing the job, but in the same way as I answered an earlier question, we also need to see the job being done in a way that's consistent across Wales. What would I regard as success? Well, I think there will be a number of components to that. I hope that the investment means that individuals get better answers and quicker answers to the questions that they are raising with health boards. That will be a very important test of success. And a second one would be that we are able to go further in drawing the lessons, the collective lessons that you get when you are analysing large numbers of cases. So in the health service, they call it root cause analysis. It's a term of art there. And that's a way of looking at individual cases, but then using that learning to get back to the root cause of what might have linked the experience of those cases together. And if we learnt lessons and we learnt them better and quicker, that would be another test of success for me.
Thank you for that, First Minister. Can I just broaden it out a little? I'm hearing of increasing concern about how well or not Welsh hospitals are coping with routine critical infection control to ensure minimal hospital-acquired illness and disease beyond COVID. Of course, COVID is part of the picture still. How confident are you that the highest standards of infection control are routinely being achieved in Welsh hospitals?
Well, look, let me just first of all say something about the enormous pressure hospitals are under. Because not only do we have record levels of pressure in emergency services, not only are hospitals still having to deal with hundreds of people who are ill from coronavirus, but they're also doing everything they can to catch up on those planned treatments that had to be postponed while the crisis was most acute. That means that our hospitals are fuller than they ever have been. We have over 90% bed occupation routinely now, day in, day out in our hospitals in Wales. And the more people you have in hospital And the faster you try and turn it around, because that's another part of trying to catch up on planned treatment is, you want people to be in the hospital for only as long as they need to be there, then the challenge of hospital-acquired infections just gets bigger. The more people you've got in the hospital, the harder that challenge is. What I do know is that there's been an enormous focus on improving infection control measures across the Welsh NHS, that stepped up again during the pandemic because of the need to attend to the transmissibility of coronavirus. It's a challenge, and you've got to work at it every single day. And anybody who goes into a hospital and is waiting to go and see somebody will have seen those charts on the wall that every day track the level of hospital-acquired infections at the ward level and then at the hospital level. So I am confident that people do their very best, but I'm also having to be realistic about the nature of the challenge that people face.
Thank you very much.
Tom, thank you. And finally, today to Ollie Boone at Democracy Unlocked. No, Ollie not managing to get on. Tom, you are the last person in what might be the last press conference of this sort. So thank you. And I should have said, thank you to all our journalist colleagues who've put such effort into making sure we've been able to use this forum to offer information to people and occasionally even to answer some of their questions. Diolch yn fawr. Thank you very much indeed.